Louise, dear, after the third and last hurricane passed into history, Miami is still on the map. We will now look forward to a prosperous winter. Was over town yesterday morning, and at 10 o'clock the warning signals were posted. We were to expect it about the latter part of the afternoon or early in the evening. It began to blow and continued getting stronger as night came on. In the hotel, the doors were barred and rugs rolled against them. All the windows were braced. The bathroom doors shut tight on account of the ventilators from the air shaft, and everything shipshape for such another siege as September 18th. Just about dark people began pouring in, all expecting the worst to happen. I went off duty at 6:30 and went up to my room. There were no lights by this time. I took off my shoes and dress. If I was to be knocked about by the wind or picked out of the debris, I didn't want it to be in flimsy pajamas. How the wind howled, but I slept soundly. My roommate came in about 10:30. The rain had beaten in the telephone room, and as she didn't fancy soaking her feet in rainwater, she left the telephone board. Woke up this morning feeling groggy, as we had no air all night, to find a gentle breeze blowing, nice blue sky, and our grand and glorious sunshine everywhere. That for the storm of October 20th. The hurricane of September 18th is a far different story. The first I heard of that was Friday afternoon, when my boyfriend called me on the phone and told me not to go out on a boat as I had planned on doing. We were to dine and dance on the water that evening. He told me we were going to get some heavy winds around 11 or 12. After dinner, I decided to rest for an hour before dressing. I stretched out very comfortably, and the next thing I knew, my roommate woke me up saying, "You've got to wake up. I'm so nervous and this wind is terrible." That was about 4. What is it? A thunderstorm? And right away, I'm told that it isn't thunder, it's wind. I didn't know wind could make so much noise. It had been blowing hard since midnight. The Florida Power and Light plant was about a mile across the bay, and sometimes we could see the light, but most of the time we couldn't. Everything else was in darkness. There was a barge smashing against the bridge, and a beautiful yacht right under our window was being dashed to pieces on the seawall. In the lull, we could hear the men aboard shouting. Finally, the lights went out and we could hear no more. I suppose they abandoned her when the water got inside. At daylight, we could see her piled up on the wall, half submerged in the bay and the rest on land. The barge had disappeared entirely at dawn. It must have sunk because it couldn't go under the viaduct. Our room is on the 4th floor, although it's the first for bedrooms. About 4 feet from the bay is the grill, the arcade and shops. The next floor, lounge, office, lobby, dining room, and kitchen. On the 3rd floor are the mezzanine, a balcony for orchestra, private dining rooms, linen room, etc. Then are the bedrooms. Our room is on the west facing the bay, and the wind was coming from the northeast. So we were in luck. Our room was okay until the second storm struck it. The first half of the storm took awnings, windows, screens, draperies, and everything on the north and east. The rooms were flooded, clothes, bedding, furniture, and everything in them was ruined. We came downstairs about 5. Gee, how spooky it was. Inky black, and the wind howling through the corridors, but what a wreck. The lobby and the mezzanine. There was about 2 inches of water in the lobby on the 2nd floor. One of the boys rescued a tiny kitten from the elevator shaft. Poor little thing was nearly drowned and so cold. He was the engine room kitten, and I rubbed him dry with my hanky. About daylight, we began getting refugees from all over the beach, some in bathing suits, carrying what clothes they could in suitcases, or wrapped in bundles. They looked like immigrants from Europe or Mexico. Some of them swam part of the way. The wind died down, and we thought it was all over. Then suddenly, bang, A gust of wind from the south took all the windows from that end of the dining room and sent panes of glass spinning the whole length of the room. It was much stronger than the first one and carried all before it. The big doors to the dining room were barred. The dining room faces south and northwest and had all French windows. In an hour there wasn't a whole pane of glass, and the kitchen the same. In the grill on the ground floor, the water was over the tops of the tables and they floated at will. The ocean and bay met there, and we were sure it would wash away the foundation and the building would collapse. You would think the people in the hotel would have been in hysterics, fainting and whatnot. Everyone was as calm outwardly as if nothing more than a thunderstorm was in progress. Some were crying silently. Some, and perhaps all of them, were praying too. We could see the water getting higher every hour, and that's a long time when every minute you're expecting a building to crush in on you. We couldn't go outside because the wind would blow you into the bay or perhaps on the roof of a building. It was turning cars upside down, ripping off the tops, and lifting them right off the pavement. The kitchen ranges are run by electricity, so no current, no food. They managed to get an oil stove burning and made coffee. It was cold and salty. You know, the rain was salty too. Everything tasted salty for a week. When the wind came from the south, it took everything on the west side. Our room was flooded. My watch was on the dresser and it laid in water until late that night. I'd forgotten it. As soon as we were sure the storm was over, we began exploring South Beach. What a wreck. In some places, we waded in water to our waists, not knowing whether we'd step on a live wire, tin, or glass. Anything could be in the middle of the street. One place, a fruit stand had been blown all over and the owner was busy salvaging what he could all the time, shouting, "Open for business, same place, same prices." Yes, it was funny. He picked up a dozen apples for us. How good they tasted. We came across a place where they were serving hot coffee. It was hot. I had 2 cups of that and felt like $1,000,000. In the morning before the coffee was made, they got water-soaked bread, meat, and bananas. I had a banana, but didn't try the meat. When we came back from looking over the remains of the town, they had quite a force working in the kitchen, and at 5:30 they served Irish stew picnic fashion in the once beautiful lounge. Part of the roof was blown off during the second half of the storm, and the plaster came off the top floor. All that day, Saturday, we took care of refugees. That night, the rooms were given to women and children. The men slept where they could, though the majority of them didn't sleep. Even women sat up all night in chairs. Twins were born to a woman during the heaviest of the storm. She was in a house with the roof off. She was brought here. She lived, and one of the twins survived as well. Can you imagine a thing like that? Whole sides were taken off apartment houses and hotels. One place showed the floor plan from the outside. Big garages crashed in on hundreds of cars. I couldn't begin to write of the sights that day. Sunday morning at 8 o'clock, I started for Hollywood. I really wasn't so worried about them out there because they were over a mile from the ocean and the houses were built low. I didn't think it would strike there like it did at the beach. The causeway was badly wrecked, no one knew just how much. No cars could cross. I started to walk. A cop on the beach told me I couldn't get across, and even if I did, I wouldn't be allowed to go in the city as it was under martial law. I just had to go, so I started. The causeway is 3.5 miles long, I think. Going across, the first thing I saw was a huge gasoline tank, about 4 feet in diameter and about 10 feet long. It had been washed onto the bridge from one of the barges in the bay. Then a big ship from Philadelphia wedged tight against the viaduct. The sides of the ship were all battered and splintered. On the causeway, they have iron poles that run the wires, and those were bent flat. One would be pointing south, and the next one north. You can judge the force of the wind from that. It blew 131 miles an hour. The causeway runs east and west with a bridge at each end. The streetcar tracks are in the middle, and one side is for westbound traffic, and the other side east. It's wide enough to drive 4 cars abreast. 2 big barges were right where the car tracks were supposed to be. The road had been carried into the bay in some places. Autos of all sizes and makes were in the bay when people went sightseeing between the storms. A big barge loaded with sand was right up on the road. Great holes had been washed in the road, mostly on the westbound side. On the end of the east bridge, a big tanker was sitting right up on the viaduct, and it had crushed 3 boats under it and the wall. They got that tanker off last week. The county causeway protected the Venetian. It had one bad place, and that was fixed right away for Red Cross ambulance and emergency cars. When I got to Bayshore Drive, I was very much surprised to see all the boats that were originally moored in the bay parked on lawns. Very few of the autos kept their top. I found a restaurant open, and by candlelight they were serving breakfast. I was so darned hungry by that time. I hadn't had a thing since the Irish stew of the night before. And not knowing when I'd get a chance again, I flew myself to honeydew, pancakes, and 2 cups of coffee. After that, I knew I could get to Hollywood if I had to walk. Although high heel shoes aren't so good for a long hike, and I'd already done 4 miles. I tried to find Ted to get him to go to Hollywood with me, but he was then trying to get permission to get to the beach, to know if I was all right. He knew the Floridian was standing. I went to the bus station and heard from a driver who had made a round trip that morning that Hollywood and Lauderdale had been wiped out. All the houses in West Hollywood had been blown away, and the east side was almost as bad. That darn near scared me to death. If it hadn't been for the pancakes I'd just eaten, I would have collapsed. At the time, one of the drivers was at City Hall trying to get a permit to take a bus to Lauderdale and bring it back. He was gone so long I knew it was hopeless to wait, so I went to the railroad station. They said a train would leave in an hour. Can you see me pacing up and down, nearly frantic and having to wait? That would mean an hour and a half before I could get there. After years, it seemed, we got underway, and as we left the city, things began to look even worse. By the time I got to Hollywood, I thought I couldn't stand another minute's suspense. There, at the Dixie and Polk Saint, the street Arthur and Winifred lived on, was a grocery store flat on the ground and a soldier sitting on the ruins on guard. I started to run down that street. Every house was wrecked. I couldn't see their place, and the thought of them with the children perhaps under it. Gee, it was awful. I rushed across the street to the only house in that vicinity that was standing. A very old lady, on the verge of collapse, told me everyone was okay. She was so nervous she couldn't talk intelligently. Just when I started to go, her daughter-in-law arrived. She said my folks were all right, but she didn't know where they were. I thought Lena was in Montreal. She had gone there with Mrs. Nesbit. I thought Mrs. Groff didn't want me to know they were hurt. I couldn't understand why she didn't know where they were, unless they had been taken to a hospital, or perhaps a morgue. I started out to find them. I went over to the East Side hotels first. The Great Southern had been turned into a hospital. I inquired there. A man in charge told me people had come in so fast that no one thought of registering them. They had brought dead and wounded there, too. Would I like to try to identify the seriously wounded and dead? I ran from the place, then had the same experience at the Parkview, and was told to try the schoolhouse, the East and West Dormitory, and the Hollywood Hills Inn. By that time, I was going along in the middle of the road with tears rolling down my cheeks. I stopped a man and asked him to take me to the Hills Inn. He said, "Sure." And then his motor stalled and couldn't be started. I stopped a Ford, and who should that be but the fellow who lived next door to Lena and Cece. The first thing he said was, "Everyone is safe. Lena and Cecil are in the West Side dormitory, and Arthur and the children are in the Hills. Hello, are you all right? Had to tell you about the folks first because I thought you were going to faint." It sure made me feel faint, and that's something I don't do. I met Charlie about 5 o'clock, and as the city was under martial law, and I'd have to be off the street at 6. And with a walk of 3 miles, I sure was glad to see that boy. My heels, toes, and the whole of my feet were blistered. I had a hunk of glass gone into my heel that was just a bit painful. On the whole, I didn't think I'd ever stand again. When I saw poor Eni, her nose and lip were cut, and she had worried so about me. She and Cece had been through so much. At the same time I arrived, Cecil and Arthur had started to walk to Miami Beach via the beach road. That's 17 miles. Cecil's car had been smashed up and water-soaked. Lena and Cecil were in the house when it blew over. They were standing in the door waiting to step outside when the suction carried them into the air. The roof landed 75 feet upside down from the foundation. They were thrown into the roof. A big ice box came down close to their heads. Big pines crashed to the ground but couldn't be heard because of the roar of the wind. Their house blew over about 5, and they were in water to their hips until after 12. A lady and her husband came from a home nearby, thinking Lena and Cecil were under the wreckage, and as they came out, a pine tree crashed, missing them by seconds. Cecil's back, shoulders, and legs were badly bruised. He had his arms around Lena, and when they landed, he was underneath and saved her some. He held a board in front of her face to protect her from flying glass. Arthur and Winifred left their house when it moved off the foundation. They went into a house across the street that seemed to be standing better than the rest. They got out in a lull. There were some ghastly sights in the West Side dorm. One wing had been turned into a hospital. One little girl about 3 years old had a stick driven into her chest. She had a hole as big as my thumb, and she was so good, no fussing at all. A stick went right through a man's heart. He bled to death in a short time. A family of 7, the mother and father were killed. The 5 children survived. Hundreds of cases just as pathetic. That night in Hollywood, 8 of us had to sleep in one room. We had mattresses and blankets, and that's all. I hadn't washed since Friday night. Another girl and myself decided we'd go into the dormitory and, if necessary, take a dead man from his bed for one night. It didn't get to that because in the corridor, we found 2 single beds. We took one, leaving the other in case someone came in during the night and needed it. The next day, I waited in line an hour for a permit to get back in town. The roads were open north to anyone who wanted to leave, but not traveling south. I told them I was working at the beach, and after them asking me when I left, why I left, and how I got to Hollywood, and then informing me I couldn't come back, they finally let me go back to Miami. Then I had to do the same thing at the Venetian Causeway, but I was let through and bummed a ride with a girl driving a Red Cross car. A Miami Beach resident said that a hurricane is a hell of a lot of wind in a hell of a lot of hurry. Don't know if that would be found in Webster's, but we who have lived through a hurricane can have our own definitions. Now for the funny side of it, a fellow who works on the Tribune went out between blows for a look and see. He started back home about the same time the wind came from the south. It blew him like a piece of paper across 3 lots, so he steered himself in the direction of his home. His luck held, and he was blown right through the screen door on the porch. His mother, seeing him coming so fast, opened the front door, and the wind took the kitchen from the rear of the house and smashed it into the garage. Just fancy you open the front door and the kitchen blows out the back. A family living 4 miles from a dairy found 3 cows waiting round their backyard. They still had them 1 week after the storm. People living within a block or two of the ocean were dodging big fish, but no one had any desire to fish. One man got hit so hard in the head by one as it came through the window that it knocked him out. I'm sending Mother a few views in book form. I sent her a picture of the causeway. If you'd like to see them, call her up. If she wants to read this, you wouldn't mind? I could possibly do this again in a lifetime. But I do wish I could write of this affair like some people could. However, you asked for it, and here it is. By the way, we are promised another for the 20th. Do hope there won't be so much to write about next time. I've sure got writer's cramp. I started this at 1 o'clock and it is now 5:20. My gosh, Louise, I'm a wreck. If this next hurricane is as bad as the one in September, I'm going to go north for the skating at Harford's. What do you say? If I write another word, my finger will break. Best as always, Kaye. Hope I have enough money to pay the postage. Perhaps I'll put a 2-cent stamp on it and leave the rest to you. You'll excuse errors, I can't read this over.